bunting stretched cheerfully across the vicarage lawn of St. Mary Mead, its faded colors catching the afternoon breeze like pressed flowers released from an old prayer book. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath the ancient elm tree, her knitting needles moving with practiced rhythm while her pale blue eyes surveyed the gentle chaos of the annual church fete. Children darted between the stalls with sticky fingers and bright laughter, while their elders gathered in familiar clusters. Teacups balanced precariously as conversations flowed like honey from a jar. The Reverend Leonard Clement moved through his guests with benevolent distraction, his wife Griselda smoothing the inevitable rough edges with her particular gift for making everyone feel both welcome and slightly managed. Near the cake stall, Mrs. Price Ridley held court with her lorgnette, dispensing opinions with the authority of one who had never doubted her own judgment. Colonel Bantry, resplendent in his blazer and regimental tie, was explaining something to Dr. Haydock with the earnest intensity of a man who believed all problems could be solved with proper organization and a stiff drink. At the center of the afternoon's anticipation stood Miss Lavinia Greenshaw, the village's most prominent spinster and keeper of considerable secrets. She clutched a telegram in her gloved hands, reading and rereading its contents with an expression that suggested both triumph and trepidation. The message had arrived that morning from her solicitor in London, confirming the details of an inheritance that would transform her from comfortable gentility to genuine wealth. More importantly, it announced the imminent arrival of a crucial document, a letter containing the final settlement papers that would make her fortune official. The 4:15 post should bring it, she announced to anyone within hearing distance, her voice carrying the peculiar mixture of excitement and anxiety that accompanies life-changing moments. Mr. Weatherby assured me it would arrive today without fail. 40 years I've waited for Uncle Mortimer's estate to be settled, and today it shall finally be resolved. Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly. She had observed enough of human nature to know that the anticipation of sudden wealth often revealed more about people's true characters than years of ordinary interaction. Already she could see the subtle shifts in behavior around Miss Greenshaw, the way Mrs. Price Ridley's smile had become more attentive, how young Timothy Forsyth, the village ne'er-do-well, had suddenly discovered an interest in helping with the tea-urn. The postman, reliable Mr. Summerson, arrived precisely at 4:30, his bicycle bell announcing his presence as he navigated between the tables. A small crowd gathered expectantly as he consulted his leather satchel with ceremonial gravity. "Nothing for Miss Greenshaw today, I'm afraid," he announced, his weathered face creased with genuine regret. "Check twice, I did. Sometimes the London post runs late, but there's nothing bearing your name." The silence that followed was profound in its awkwardness. Miss Greenshaw's face cycled through disbelief, confusion, and finally a brittle kind of anger that made her hands tremble. "Impossible," she said, her voice rising slightly. "Mr. Weatherby specifically promised. The settlement cannot proceed without those papers, and there are deadlines to consider." "Perhaps tomorrow's post," suggested Griselda kindly, but her words seemed to fall into a well of disappointment. It was then that young Timothy Forsyth stepped forward with the eager helpfulness of someone sensing opportunity. "I say, Miss Greenshaw, perhaps I could telephone your solicitor. Sort things out, you know. These legal fellows can be frightfully disorganized." His smile was charming, practiced, and Miss Marple noted how his eyes lingered on the telegram still clutched in Miss Greenshaw's hand. "How thoughtful of you, Timothy," Miss Greenshaw replied, though her tone suggested she found his sudden attentiveness more puzzling than comforting. "Though I hardly think it necessary to trouble Mr. Weatherby over a simple postal delay." The afternoon proceeded with the determined cheerfulness that English villages summon in the face of disappointment, but Miss Marple observed the undercurrents with growing interest. Timothy had positioned himself near the refreshment table, where he could overhear conversations while appearing to help serve lemonade. Mrs. Price Ridley's earlier warmth toward Miss Greenshaw had cooled noticeably, replaced by the distant politeness reserved for those whose social stock had suddenly become uncertain. As the shadows lengthened and the fete began its gentle wind-down, Miss Greenshaw accepted a glass of lemonade from Timothy with absent-minded gratitude. She had been standing for hours, her disappointment evident in the slight slump of her shoulders, the way she kept glancing toward the village road as if willing the missing letter into existence. "Drink up," Timothy encouraged with solicitous charm. "You've had quite a trying afternoon." Miss Greenshaw raised the glass to her lips, then paused. Something in Timothy's expression, too eager, too watchful, made her hesitate. "You know," she said slowly, "this tastes rather odd, almost bitter." The glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the flagstone path. She swayed, one hand reaching for the nearby table, her face suddenly pale as morning mist. "I feel most peculiar," she whispered, before collapsing among the scattered fragments of crystal and the spreading pool of innocent-looking lemonade. Dr. Haydock was beside her in moments, his practiced hands checking pulse and breathing while the gathered crowd pressed closer with horrified fascination. "Stand back, please," he commanded quietly, but his face had already assumed the grave expression that needed no explanation. Miss Marple's knitting lay forgotten in her lap as she watched Timothy Forsyth's reaction to the tragedy unfolding before them. While others showed shock or distress, his face displayed something else entirely, a calculating assessment that suggested he was already considering how Miss Greenshaw's sudden demise might affect his own circumstances. The letter that never arrived had become irrelevant, but its absence had revealed truths far more deadly than any inheritance could have concealed. The news of Miss Lavinia Greenshaw's sudden death spread through St. Mary Mead with the peculiar velocity that accompanies village tragedies, each retelling adding fresh embellishments to the stark facts. By evening, every cottage window glowed with animated conversation, and the Blue Boar found itself hosting an impromptu inquest conducted by amateur detectives armed with strong opinions and stronger ale. Colonel Bantry, his military bearing intact despite the day's shocking events, held court near the fireplace with characteristic authority. "Mark my words, there's more to this business than meets the eye," he declared, brandishing his brandy glass for emphasis. £40,000 doesn't simply evaporate because a letter goes astray. Someone knew about that inheritance, and someone made certain poor Lavinia never lived to claim it. Mrs. Price Ridley, who had condescended to visit the establishment for the first time in living memory, adjusted her lorgnette with theatrical precision. "That Timothy Forsyth has always been entirely too charming for his own good," she pronounced with the satisfaction of one whose suspicions had finally found their target. "I observed his behavior most carefully this afternoon. His sudden attentiveness to dear Lavinia was quite unprecedented and thoroughly suspicious." The publican, George, polished glasses with mechanical efficiency while absorbing every word. Village tragedies were excellent for business, he reflected grimly, though he genuinely mourned Miss Greenshaw's passing. "Heard tell young Timothy's been asking questions about Miss Greenshaw's affairs for weeks," he offered carefully. "Sudden interest in someone he'd barely acknowledged before, if you catch my meaning." At the vicarage, Griselda Clement poured tea for Miss Marple with hands that trembled slightly despite her efforts at composure. The afternoon's events had shaken her more than she cared to admit, and she found herself seeking comfort in her elderly friend's unflappable presence. "Leonard keeps saying he should have noticed something, should have prevented it somehow," she confided, settling into her chair with weary grace. Miss Marple accepted her cup with a gentle smile that held depths of understanding. "Your husband is a good man, my dear, but goodness cannot always shield us from human nature's darker aspects. Sometimes the most innocent gatherings reveal the most complex truths." She paused thoughtfully, her pale blue eyes distant. "Tell me, did you notice anything particular about Timothy's management of the refreshments?" Meanwhile, in his modest lodgings above the bakery, Timothy Forsyth paced his small sitting room with restless energy. The afternoon had not unfolded as anticipated, and the unwelcome attention his solicitous behavior had attracted made him increasingly uncomfortable. He had cultivated his reputation as a harmless wastrel precisely because it provided excellent camouflage. But now he found himself the subject of speculation that could prove dangerous. His landlady, Mrs. Kidwell, had knocked twice offering tea and sympathy, her curiosity barely concealed beneath maternal concern. "Such a shock for you, dear, being right there when it happened. You must be quite shaken." Timothy had declined politely, understanding the subtext perfectly. In St. Mary Mead, proximity to tragedy automatically designated one either hero or suspect, and public opinion would determine which label applied. At Gossington Hall, Mrs. Bantry entertained her bridge circle with her own interpretation of events. "The timing was entirely too convenient," she declared, arranging her cards with decisive authority. "Lavinia receives inheritance news in the morning, crucial papers fail to arrive in the afternoon, and she's dead by tea time. Suspicious doesn't begin to cover it." Mrs. Carmichael nodded sagely. "But who benefits from her death? She had no close family, no obvious heir. The money will likely revert to distant relatives who don't even know of its existence." "Unless," suggested Mrs. Weatherby with conspiratorial relish, "someone knew something about the inheritance that we didn't. Perhaps there was a provision making her death advantageous to another party." Dr. Haydock, meanwhile, sat in his surgery contemplating the afternoon's events with professional unease. He had detected no telltale almond scent, heard only the word bitter, before watching color drain from a face that preferred control. The preliminary examination suggested heart failure, possibly brought on by shock, but something nagged at him. Miss Greenshaw had been in reasonably good health for her age, and her collapse had been remarkably sudden. At the post office, Miss Dora Bell repeated to anyone purchasing stamps that the London bag had arrived intact and punctual. "Nothing for Miss Greenshaw," she insisted to the growing queue of curious villagers. "Mr. Weatherby's envelopes are distinctive, heavy cream paper with blue monograms. You can't mistake them." This description circulated rapidly, generating its own theories. Colonel Bantry recalled glimpsing a cream envelope in someone's tweed pocket near the coconut shy, though whose pocket remained frustratingly unclear. His military mind, which arranged facts in parade formation, balked at such imprecise details. Miss Marple, sitting by her cottage window as darkness settled over the village, worked her knitting needles with mechanical precision while her mind processed the day's observations. The missing letter troubled her most. Important documents rarely went astray accidentally, particularly when their arrival was so eagerly anticipated. Someone had known about that letter's significance and taken steps to ensure it never reached its intended recipient. More telling still was Timothy's behavior, his unprecedented interest in Miss Greenshaw's company, his insistence on personally serving the lemonade, and most particularly that calculating expression when she hesitated before drinking. In Miss Marple's extensive experience, the truth usually lay not in dramatic gestures that captured everyone's attention, but in small inconsistencies revealed to those patient enough to watch and wise enough to understand what they were seeing. Tomorrow would bring official investigation, but tonight belonged to quiet observation and careful thought. Inspector Slack arrived from Much Benham with the methodical efficiency of a man who had learned to navigate village peculiarities without losing his professional skepticism. He established himself in the vicarage parlor, transforming Griselda's cheerful morning room into an impromptu headquarters with official papers spread across her best tablecloth and the unmistakable air of serious criminal investigation. Miss Marple appeared at precisely 10 o'clock, carrying her inevitable basket of roses and wearing the expression of gentle concern that rendered her virtually invisible to harried officials. "I do hope I'm not intruding," she murmured to Griselda. who welcomed her with obvious relief. The presence of her elderly friend provided comfort in circumstances that had shaken the vicarage's usual tranquility. Inspector Slack glanced up from his notes with perfunctory politeness. "Miss Marple, I presume? I understand you witnessed the deceased's collapse yesterday." His tone suggested he expected nothing more illuminating than the usual elderly confusion about times and details, but Miss Marple had encountered such assumptions before. "Indeed I was present, Inspector," she replied, settling into her chair with unobtrusive efficiency. Such a dreadful shock for everyone. Poor Miss Greenshaw seemed quite distressed about her correspondence failing to arrive. Her knitting needles began their gentle rhythm, a sound that somehow encouraged confidences. The inspector's pen paused meaningfully. Missing correspondence. This detail had not featured prominently in the preliminary reports, which focused primarily on Timothy Forsyth's suspicious behavior and the dramatic collapse itself. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she continued, "Oh yes. She was expecting crucial papers from her London solicitor regarding the inheritance settlement. She checked repeatedly with Mr. Summerson, quite convinced the documents should have arrived on the 4:15 post. £40,000 represents considerable motivation for ensuring such papers reach their destination safely." Inspector Slack's interest sharpened considerably. Substantial inheritances provided excellent motives for murder, particularly when combined with suspicious circumstances and convenient timing. "Do we know who benefits from her estate?" Griselda consulted her husband's parish records helpfully. According to Leonard's notes, she had no immediate family, some distant Canadian cousins, but they haven't maintained correspondence for decades. Her will leaves everything to various charities. This information puzzled Inspector Slack considerably. Murder for charitable benefit seemed unlikely even by village standards unless someone possessed information about the inheritance that others lacked. He made careful notes while maintaining his skeptical expression. Timothy Forsyth arrived when summoned, managing both injured innocence and helpful eagerness with practiced skill. Miss Marple observed his performance with the detached interest of someone who had witnessed similar displays from guilty schoolboys and unfaithful husbands. He explained readily that he had offered refreshments to everyone near the stall. Yes, he had personally served Miss Greenshaw's lemonade, and certainly he had shown concern for her obvious distress. "You didn't taste her drink yourself?" Inspector Slack inquired mildly, noting the young man's carefully rehearsed responses. "Certainly not," Timothy replied, the briefest pause suggesting he had anticipated this question. "Though I did sample the general preparation and experienced no ill effects whatsoever." Miss Marple's quiet interjection carried the weight of careful observation. Timothy showed remarkable attentiveness to Miss Greenshaw yesterday, particularly considering their previous lack of acquaintance. When she mentioned the lemonade tasted bitter, his reaction struck me as rather calculating, as though he were waiting for something specific to occur. Inspector Slack leaned forward with professional intensity. Such behavioral observations from experienced village residents often proved more valuable than forensic evidence in cases involving local suspects and complex motives. Following Timothy's departure, Miss Marple began her own investigation with characteristic discretion. At the post office, Miss Dora Bell remained vehement about the missing letter's non-arrival. "Mr. Weatherby's envelopes are quite distinctive, Miss Marple. Heavy cream paper with blue monograms. I have handled enough correspondence for the late Mr. Greenshaw to recognize them immediately." This confirmation strengthened Miss Marple's suspicion that the letter had been deliberately intercepted rather than simply delayed. Her subsequent conversation with Colonel Bantry during his morning constitutional provided the crucial missing piece. "I recall seeing a cream envelope early yesterday," he admitted thoughtfully. "Near the village green, just as the London coach was passing through. A man was holding it, though I couldn't identify him clearly. Seemed to be waiting for the coach's arrival." The implications struck Miss Marple immediately. The London coach arrived hours before the regular postal delivery, suggesting someone had arranged to intercept Miss Greenshaw's correspondence at the earliest possible moment. This required advanced knowledge of both the letter's contents and its anticipated arrival. Inspector Slack's subsequent examination of Miss Greenshaw's cottage revealed additional disturbing evidence. Among her personal effects, he discovered a small silver box containing saccharine tablets, one of which showed signs of tampering, crumbled edges suggesting it had been carefully opened and resealed. Dr. Haydock, when consulted, confirmed that certain substances could be concealed within such tablets, creating delayed poisoning effects that would manifest as heart failure. The telegram announcing the inheritance settlement also proved suspicious under closer scrutiny. When Inspector Slack contacted Mr. Weatherby's London office directly, the solicitor confirmed sending registered documents 2 days prior, but denied dispatching any telegram. The message Miss Greenshaw had received was a complete fabrication, designed to create public anticipation of wealth while ensuring the legitimate papers never arrived. As afternoon shadows lengthened across St. Mary Mead, Inspector Slack found himself confronting a case of considerable complexity. Someone had orchestrated an elaborate deception involving forged communications, intercepted correspondence, and carefully planned poisoning. The obvious suspect remained Timothy Forsyth, but Miss Marple's gentle observations suggested the truth might prove more intricate than initial appearances indicated. Inspector Slack arrived at the vicarage the following morning with the satisfied air of a man whose investigation had yielded precisely the results he anticipated. He spread his notes across Griselda's morning table with methodical efficiency, transforming the cheerful parlor into an impromptu courthouse where Timothy Forsyth would be tried in absentia before his formal arrest. "The evidence speaks quite clearly," Inspector Slack announced to the assembled group, which included Miss Marple with her inevitable knitting, Griselda hovering anxiously near the tea service, and Colonel Bantry summoned to provide his military perspective on criminal behavior. Young Forsyth possessed motive, opportunity, and means in abundance. The inspector's case unfolded with prosecutorial precision. Timothy's financial difficulties were extensive, gambling debts to London bookmakers, unpaid lodging fees stretching back months, and a lifestyle consistently exceeding his modest resources. More damning still, a search of his rooms above the bakery had revealed a small vial of digitalis concealed behind loose floorboards, along with detailed notes about Miss Greenshaw's inheritance copied from conversations overheard at the Blue Boar. Furthermore, Inspector Slack continued, with evident satisfaction, we discovered this among his possessions. He produced a delicate silver locket, tarnished with age and engraved with a faded G. Miss Greenshaw's housekeeper, Mrs. Dane, identified it immediately as belonging to her mistress. When questioned, Forsyth claimed he had borrowed it from Miss Greenshaw's cottage, intending to return it later. Colonel Bantry's military bearing stiffened with righteous indignation. Theft on top of murder, the fellow's completely beyond the pale. He recalled his glimpse of the cream envelope near the village green with increasing certainty, now convinced the mysterious figure had been Timothy waiting to intercept Miss Greenshaw's crucial correspondence. Dr. Haydock's post-mortem findings confirmed digitalis poisoning administered in sufficient quantity to cause rapid heart failure. The bitter taste Miss Greenshaw had detected suggested the poison had been dissolved directly into her lemonade, though traces were also found in one of her saccharine tablets, indicating a sophisticated two-pronged approach designed to ensure the victim's demise regardless of her beverage consumption. Village opinion crystallized swiftly around Timothy's guilt. Mrs. Price Ridley expressed vindicated satisfaction at her earlier suspicions, while the congregation at morning service buzzed with whispered confirmations that they had always sensed something unsavory about the charming young wastrel. Even Griselda, despite her charitable nature, found Timothy's possession of Miss Greenshaw's locket impossible to explain away. Yet Miss Marple remained curiously unconvinced by the mounting evidence. Her knitting needles moved with thoughtful deliberation as she absorbed Inspector Slack's confident presentation, her pale blue eyes holding the distant expression that suggested deeper contemplation of human nature's complexities. "The case does seem remarkably complete," she observed gently, her voice carrying the mild tone that often preceded her most penetrating insights. "Though I find myself wondering about certain small inconsistencies that might bear examination." Inspector Slack bristled slightly at this implied criticism. "What inconsistencies, Miss Marple? The evidence is overwhelming." Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly. "Well, there's the matter of Miss Greenshaw's gloves, for instance. She always wore them in public, a lady of particular habits, yet I distinctly recall her bare hands at the fete. Curious how stress affects our usual patterns, though it might also suggest someone had reason to keep their hands free for delicate work." She continued with characteristic understatement. "Then there's the sophistication of the crime itself. Forging telegrams, intercepting correspondence, administering poison through multiple methods, it requires considerable planning and local knowledge. Timothy strikes me as more of an opportunist than a methodical strategist." Inspector Slack found this observation more troubling than he cared to admit. The crime's complexity did seem at odds with Timothy's usual improvised approach to his various schemes and deceptions. Miss Marple's subsequent inquiries around the village revealed additional complications. Mr. Summerson, the postman, mentioned seeing someone near the garage handling an envelope that didn't belong to him by the look of it. When questioned, Mr. Pritchard admitted accepting an envelope from a gentleman to pass along to Miss Greenshaw privately, though he had subsequently misplaced it in the confusion and returned it to the mysterious donor. More significantly, Mrs. Dane revealed that Miss Greenshaw had received an unexpected visitor 3 days before her death, a well-dressed gentleman claiming to represent her late uncle's estate. He had asked detailed questions about the inheritance settlement and shown particular interest in document delivery timing. Miss Greenshaw had mentioned this visit casually, not thinking it warranted special attention. This revelation cast Timothy's guilt in an entirely different light. If someone else possessed advanced knowledge of the inheritance arrangements and Miss Greenshaw's expectations, the young man's suspicious behavior might represent coincidence rather than criminal calculation. As afternoon shadows lengthened across St. Mary Mead, Inspector Slack prepared for Timothy's arrest with diminishing confidence. The obvious evidence remained compelling, yet Miss Marple's gentle skepticism suggested that appearances might prove deceiving and that the truth lay hidden beneath carefully orchestrated misdirection designed to ensure justice never discovered the real criminal's identity. Miss Marple continued her knitting with serene concentration, her mind working through patterns far more complex than the wool in her hands, sensing that the most obvious stitch often concealed the most intricate knots beneath. Miss Marple's morning constitutional began with what appeared to be a simple errand, returning a borrowed dish to the vicarage, but her observant nature transformed routine courtesy into revealing investigation. In Griselda's scullery, the aftermath of the fete remained in careful police preservation, including the large glass jug from the lemonade stall that sat inverted on the draining board with a slow runnel of sticky residue pooling beneath. Tilting the jug carefully toward the morning light, Miss Marple discovered something that challenged the entire poisoning theory. Clinging to the sugar crystals at the bottom was a small striped corpse, a wasp that had drowned contentedly in the sweet liquid. "Poor creature," she murmured to Griselda, her pale blue eyes thoughtful. "They do adore sugar, but they're remarkably sensitive to bitter tastes. One would have thought that if the lemonade had been sufficiently bitter to prompt Miss Greenshaw's complaint, it would have deterred this little fellow entirely." This observation troubled her considerably as she made her way to Miss Greenshaw's cottage, where Mrs. Dane received her with the reddened nose and anxious demeanor of someone wrestling with grief and confusion. The sitting room maintained its characteristic neatness, but Miss Marple's trained eye noticed the small disruptions that spoke of recent investigation and underlying tension. "You must be exhausted, Mrs. Dane," Miss Marple said gently, settling herself near a small work basket by the chaise. Such a dreadful shock for the household. Her attention was drawn to a pair of grey kid gloves lying atop the mending, their quality leather showing fresh, expertly executed stitching along one thumb seam. Mrs. Dane followed her gaze with obvious distress. "I was mending those the evening before the fete. Miss Lavinia had torn the seam and was quite particular about having them perfect for the next day. But then the morning came, and she couldn't find them anywhere. Got herself into such a state, fussing about the post and the missing gloves both. Finally left without them, which was so unlike her. Miss Lavinia never appeared in public without proper gloves, never." Miss Marple examined the mending with professional interest, noting that the stitches were far too fine and even for Mrs. Dane's practical needlework. Beneath the glove lay a small rectangle of stiff cream paper used to support the leather during repair, pierced with neat needle tracks and bearing, when held to the window, the faint ghost of blue printing, the distinctive monogram that Miss Dora Bell had described as a characteristic of Mr. Weatherby's correspondence. Her subsequent visit to Mrs. Kidwell, Timothy's landlady, provided crucial testimony that further undermined the case against the young man. "I've been wrestling with my conscience something dreadful," the woman confided as they sat in her modest parlor. "Timothy's no saint, mind you, gambling and borrowing money he can't repay, but murder. I've watched that boy for 3 years, and he hasn't the stomach for real violence. Gets queasy at the sight of blood, won't even kill spiders in his room." More significantly, Mrs. Kidwell described Timothy's physical condition following Miss Greenshaw's death. Sick as a dog the next morning he was. Retching and pale, couldn't keep anything down. Said he'd eaten something disagreeable at the fete. But it seemed more like genuine shock to me. Not the behavior of someone who'd planned the whole business. Miss Marple's visit to Mr. Henderson's stationery shop revealed the most intriguing clue of all. The quiet shopkeeper adjusted his spectacles thoughtfully as he recalled Miss Greenshaw's recent purchase. "She came in quite distressed last week, asking for heavy cream paper with blue monogram, very specific requirements. I had to order it specially from London. It arrived yesterday morning, actually, but she never collected it. Said it was very important and she didn't want anyone else handling it." This revelation struck Miss Marple with particular force. Miss Greenshaw had been preparing to send correspondence using the identical paper that her solicitor employed, suggesting she had been manipulated into believing she needed to respond to or authenticate the inheritance documents in some specific way. Dr. Haydick's professional assessment provided the final piece of the emerging puzzle. "The digitalis concentration was remarkably precise," he explained when Miss Marple called at his surgery that evening. "Too much would have been detected immediately. Too little might have failed entirely. Someone possessed considerable pharmacological knowledge. The dual delivery method, both in the lemonade and concealed within a carefully modified saccharine tablet, demonstrated medical expertise far beyond Timothy's capabilities." As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat in her cottage garden, her knitting needles moving with mechanical precision while her mind worked through the accumulated evidence. The pattern that emerged was far more sophisticated than Timothy's obvious guilt suggested. Someone with professional knowledge had orchestrated Miss Greenshaw's death with military precision, using multiple delivery methods to ensure success while creating elaborate misdirection. The missing gloves had prevented Miss Greenshaw from handling potentially poisoned surfaces, while the intercepted correspondence and forged telegram had created a public expectation of wealth that would make her death appear either coincidental or motivated by obvious greed. The mysterious visitor, who had recommended saccharin and asked detailed questions about document timing, possessed knowledge that extended far beyond casual interest. Most tellingly, the cream paper used for mending Miss Greenshaw's gloves suggested that the crucial letter had indeed arrived, but had been intercepted and repurposed by someone who understood both the inheritance arrangements and Miss Greenshaw's meticulous habits. Timothy Forsyth, for all his moral flexibility, lacked both the sophistication and the insider knowledge necessary for such elaborate deception. The real murderer remained hidden behind a facade of respectability, having used Timothy's suspicious behavior as convenient camouflage while orchestrating a crime that required intimate knowledge of both Miss Greenshaw's routines and the technical aspects of untraceable poisoning. Tomorrow would bring the delicate task of exposing this carefully concealed truth. The revelation that Timothy Forsyth might be innocent sent uncomfortable ripples through St. Mary Mead as residents found themselves confronting the disturbing possibility that their real murderer walked among them with undetected confidence. At the Blue Boar that evening, conversations took on a more cautious tone as familiar faces regarded each other with newfound wariness, while Miss Marple's gentle but persistent questioning continued to undermine Inspector Slack's carefully constructed case against the obvious suspect. Dr. Haydock's arrival at the public house carried particular significance, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by professional concern that seemed to weigh heavily upon his shoulders. "I've been reviewing Miss Greenshaw's medical history," he announced to the assembled company, settling into his customary chair with uncharacteristic gravity. "Something's been troubling me about the circumstances of her death." He paused to order his usual brandy before continuing with careful deliberation. "She consulted me just last week about digestive troubles, specifically asking about saccharine as a sugar substitute for her condition. Said someone had recommended it with very particular instructions about dosage and timing." This revelation electrified the gathering as Colonel Bantry leaned forward with military intensity. Someone with medical knowledge recommended saccharine, professional-level advice? The implications struck him immediately. Whoever had provided such specific guidance possessed intimate understanding of both pharmacology and Miss Greenshaw's personal health circumstances. Miss Marple, observing from her corner table with characteristic discretion, felt the pieces of an increasingly complex puzzle shifting into clearer focus. Her subsequent inquiries around the village revealed a pattern of systematic manipulation that extended far beyond the simple poisoning Inspector Slack had initially investigated. Mrs. Dane, when questioned gently about her mistress's final weeks, described a series of visits from helpful gentlemen offering investment advice, legal recommendations, and even charitable giving suggestions that had left Miss Greenshaw quite overwhelmed by unwanted attention. Among Miss Greenshaw's personal papers, Miss Marple discovered notes written in increasingly shaky handwriting, recording various pieces of financial advice that all seemed to originate from the same mysterious source. More significantly, several entries mentioned recommendations about changing legal representation from the established Mr. Weatherby to someone more modern and aggressive in handling substantial inheritances. Advice that would have effectively isolated Miss Greenshaw from her long-time protections. The physical evidence proved equally revealing upon closer examination. The grey kid gloves that Mrs. Dane had mended so carefully showed stitching far too fine and precise for a housekeeper's practical needlework. When Miss Marple visited Mr. Broom, the much Benham cobbler, he confirmed using a piece of stiff paper as backing for the leather repair. Paper that, when held to the light, revealed the ghostly impression of blue, monogrammed printing characteristic of Mr. Weatherby's correspondence. The crucial letter had indeed arrived, but had been intercepted and repurposed by someone who understood both Miss Greenshaw's meticulous habits and the technical requirements of document forgery. George, the Blue Boar's publican, when pressed about recent guests, recalled a London gentleman registered as Mr. Lake who had occupied the back room for 2 nights, used the telephone repeatedly, and departed on the morning of the fete, only to reappear quietly at noon. Among the man's forgotten possessions was a match folder from St. Cyprian's nursing home in London, a detail that made Dr. Haydock's expression tighten with unmistakable recognition when Miss Marple mentioned it during her visit to his surgery. The doctor's subsequent explanation of digitalis poisoning revealed professional expertise that extended beyond simple medical knowledge into the realm of criminal sophistication. The dosage was remarkably precise, he admitted with obvious discomfort. Too much would have been detected immediately. Too little might have failed entirely. Someone possessed considerable pharmacological understanding. His description of the dual delivery method, both in lemonade and concealed within modified saccharin tablets, demonstrated medical skills far beyond Timothy's capabilities. More damning still was the revelation of Dr. Haydock's particular involvement in the fate preparations. Griselda Clement recalled his insistence on separate pitchers for water and lemonade, his attention to hygiene details that seemed excessive for a village gathering, and his positioning near the refreshment table throughout the crucial period when Miss Greenshaw received her fatal dose. Timothy's eager offer to manage the serving had provided perfect cover for someone else's more sinister manipulations. The locket found in Timothy's possession presented another piece of carefully orchestrated evidence. Mrs. Dane insisted she had seen no unauthorized visitors to Miss Greenshaw's cottage, yet the jewelry had somehow found its way into the young man's room. Miss Marple recognized this as planted evidence, designed to cement suspicion against the convenient scapegoat while deflecting attention from the true perpetrator's more sophisticated crimes. As evening shadows lengthened across the village, Miss Marple sat in her garden contemplating the emerging pattern with growing certainty. The murderer possessed not only medical knowledge and criminal cunning, but also the social respectability necessary to gain Miss Greenshaw's confidence over an extended period. Someone whose advice would be accepted without question, whose presence attracted no suspicion, and whose professional expertise provided both motive and means for the elaborate deception that had culminated in murder. Tomorrow would bring the delicate task of exposing this carefully concealed predator, but tonight Miss Marple decided upon a strategic gambit. She would let it be known, quietly but deliberately, that the missing letter had been discovered in a most unexpected location. Then she would watch whose hands betrayed them when faced with the possibility that their perfect crime might finally be unraveling, revealing the truth that lay hidden beneath layers of professional respectability and calculated misdirection. Miss Marple's carefully orchestrated revelation about the recovered letter spread through St. Mary Mead with the deliberate precision of a master angler casting her line into troubled waters. She mentioned it first to Mrs. Lumley during their morning encounter at the baker's, suggesting with characteristic understatement that the crucial document had been discovered in most unexpected circumstances and would soon illuminate the entire mystery surrounding Miss Greenshaw's death. The information rippled through the village's interconnected network of morning calls, afternoon teas, and evening visits with satisfying speed, reaching every household by noon and creating exactly the atmosphere of nervous anticipation that Miss Marple had intended. Dr. Haydock's reaction to this news proved particularly revealing when Miss Marple encountered him near the Memorial Cross that afternoon. His usual genial manner had acquired a sharp edge of anxiety that seemed disproportionate to mere professional curiosity, and his questions about the letter's contents carried an intensity that made Miss Marple's pale blue eyes sharpen with interest. "Fascinating development," he remarked with forced casualness, his medical bag clutched more tightly than usual against his side. "I suppose Inspector Slack will want to examine it immediately for fingerprints and other technical evidence." The probing continued as he fell into step beside Miss Marple toward the post office, his conversation taking on the calculated tone of someone fishing for specific information. One wonders what sort of legal complications might arise from delayed correspondence in inheritance matters. Professional liability, perhaps, for solicitors who fail to ensure timely delivery of crucial documents. His voice carried the undertone of someone calculating potential consequences, rather than expressing idle speculation about postal irregularities. Miss Marple's gentle response carried layers of meaning that only the guilty would fully appreciate. "Oh, I suspect the letter will reveal far more than simple postal delays, Doctor. Sometimes the most innocent documents expose the most elaborate deceptions, particularly when they've been handled by someone with intimate knowledge of both legal procedures and medical expertise." She paused near the village green, her observant gaze studying his face with characteristic perception. The precision required for such manipulation suggests considerable professional training. That evening, the atmosphere at the Blue Boar had acquired an electric tension as villagers gathered to discuss the day's unsettling developments. Timothy Forsyth, recently released from custody pending Inspector Slack's renewed investigation, sat in subdued silence while conversations swirled around him with nervous energy. His presence served as an uncomfortable reminder that their rush to judgment might have condemned an innocent man while allowing the real murderer to continue walking among them with undetected confidence. Colonel Bantry held court near the fireplace with diminished authority, his military bearing intact, but his confidence clearly shaken by the emerging evidence. "Mark my words, there's been systematic deception from the very beginning," he declared, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Someone with considerable planning ability has orchestrated this entire business to deflect suspicion from themselves onto more obvious targets." Mrs. Price Ridley's lorgnette focused on Dr. Haydock with unprecedented scrutiny, her expression suggesting that long-time assumptions about respectability were undergoing uncomfortable revision. "I've been reconsidering certain observations from the fate," she announced with the satisfaction of someone whose suspicions had found a new and more satisfying target. The good doctor showed remarkable interest in the refreshment arrangements, particularly the lemonade preparation. Most unusual attention to detail for someone supposedly attending as a guest. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace, creating uncomfortable silence among the assembled villagers who had never before questioned their doctor's professional integrity. Dr. Haydock's response carried defensive undertones that suggested guilt rather than injured innocence. "Professional habit, nothing more," he protested with forced joviality that fooled no one present. "Medical training naturally encourages attention to hygiene matters, particularly in food preparation for public consumption." Miss Marple's quiet interjection cut through the tension with surgical precision. Such conscientious attention to detail would certainly extend to understanding the precise dosage required for digitalis poisoning, wouldn't it? Professional knowledge that would ensure success, while avoiding detection through excessive amounts that might be immediately obvious to other medical practitioners. The doctor's face had acquired a pallor that seemed entirely inconsistent with mere professional concern or wounded dignity. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his drink, and his eyes avoided direct contact with the assembled company whose trust he had systematically betrayed. "I find these implications quite offensive," he managed, though his voice lacked any conviction. "My medical oath requires preserving life, not destroying it for personal gain." Inspector Slack's arrival interrupted the increasingly tense confrontation, his expression grim with new revelations that had emerged from his renewed investigation. "Dr. Haydock, I need to speak with you privately about certain discrepancies in your statement regarding Miss Greenshaw's medical history and your recent financial circumstances." The formal tone suggested that official suspicion had finally focused on the correct target, guided by Miss Marple's patient observation and systematic elimination of false leads. As the evening progressed toward its inevitable conclusion, Miss Marple observed the gradual collapse of professional respectability that had provided perfect camouflage for calculated murder. The precision of the poisoning, the sophisticated manipulation of correspondence, and the intimate knowledge of Miss Greenshaw's personal habits could only have come from someone with professional access and criminal intent, whose medical expertise had ultimately become the very proof of guilt. The morning after Inspector Slack's quiet questioning brought an atmosphere of barely contained tension to St. Mary Mead, as villagers found themselves confronting the disturbing possibility that their trusted doctor might be capable of calculated murder. The comfortable certainties of village life had been shaken to their foundations, and conversations that once flowed freely now carried undertones of suspicion and disbelief. Miss Marple observed these changes with characteristic perception, understanding that the time had arrived for her most delicate psychological gambit, a carefully orchestrated test designed to provoke the critical reaction that would confirm Dr. Haydock's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. She arranged to encounter him at his surgery under the innocent pretext of seeking treatment for a minor complaint, her rheumatism having flared with the recent damp weather. The timing was deliberate, calculated to catch him in circumstances where his professional facade would be most vulnerable to her gentle but persistent probing. Dr. Haydock received her with strained politeness that barely concealed his obvious anxiety, his usually steady hands betraying a slight tremor as he conducted his examination, his eyes shadowed by sleeplessness that suggested a conscience under considerable strain. Miss Marple settled into the consulting room chair with apparent casualness, her knitting basket positioned beside her as her pale blue eyes began their systematic observation. "Such a trying time for you, Doctor," she began with characteristic gentleness, her voice carrying the sympathetic tone that had encouraged countless confessions over the years. "All this unpleasantness surrounding poor Miss Greenshaw's death, and now's Inspector Slack's inquiries creating such uncomfortable speculation. It must be quite distressing for someone of your professional standing." Dr. Haydock's response carried the first telltale signs of defensive calculation rather than genuine medical concern. "One attempts to maintain professional composure during these difficult circumstances," he replied with forced authority, his voice lacking its usual confident warmth. "Though I confess the inspector's implications about my involvement are both offensive and entirely unfounded, I devoted considerable effort to Miss Greenshaw's medical care, particularly her recent digestive troubles." Miss Marple's knitting needles began their gentle rhythm as she prepared to spring her carefully constructed trap. "How remarkably prescient of you to anticipate her need for dietary modifications before her inheritance was even confirmed," she observed with characteristic understatement. "Mrs. Dane mentioned your saccharine recommendation coming several days before the telegram announcing the settlement arrived. Such foresight suggests intimate knowledge of circumstances that hadn't yet been publicly revealed." The chronological inconsistency struck Dr. Haydock with visible force, his medical bag shifting nervously in his grip as he attempted to construct a plausible explanation. "Professional instinct based on family medical histories and stress patterns," he managed, though his voice had acquired the strained quality of someone improvising under pressure rather than recalling genuine medical decisions. Miss Marple continued her systematic dismantling of his defensive positions with the patient persistence of someone who had observed human nature's complexities for decades. "I've been consulting with Dr. Pemberton from Much Benham about the remarkable precision of the digitalis dosage found in Miss Greenshaw's system," she mentioned conversationally. He expressed considerable admiration for the pharmacological expertise required to achieve such specific concentrations. Too much would have been immediately obvious. Too little might have failed entirely. Dr. Haydock's face had acquired a waxy pallor that seemed entirely inconsistent with innocent professional concern as he struggled to deflect suspicion toward more convenient targets. "Young Forsyth had ample opportunity to obtain digitalis from garden sources," he protested with increasing desperation. "Foxglove grows wild throughout the district, and anyone with basic botanical knowledge could extract sufficient quantities." Miss Marple's response demonstrated the methodical accumulation of evidence that had characterized her entire investigation. Yet the autopsy revealed pharmaceutical-grade digitalis, not crude plant extracts, she replied with gentle authority. Moreover, the dual delivery method, both in lemonade and concealed within modified saccharine tablets, suggests medical sophistication far beyond amateur botanical poisoning, the sort of precision that would require extensive professional training and access to pure pharmaceutical preparations. The doctor's carefully maintained composure finally began cracking under sustained psychological pressure as Miss Marple introduced her most devastating revelation. The financial pressures you've been experiencing must have created considerable anxiety," she observed with characteristic understatement. "Mrs. Bantry mentioned your recent inquiries about private practice opportunities in London, suggesting urgent need for capital that Miss Greenshaw's gratitude might have provided, or her disapproval might have permanently denied." This personal reference struck Dr. Haydock with particular force, as his gambling debts and professional obligations had indeed created desperate circumstances that made Miss Greenshaw's potential accusations appear as threats to his very survival. His medical practice was failing, his reputation increasingly tarnished by whispered concerns about his reliability, and his creditors becoming more insistent about immediate payment of substantial sums accumulated through years of poor judgment and worse luck. Miss Marple's final psychological thrust proved devastatingly effective as she delivered the blow that would shatter his remaining defenses. "The letter that never arrived has finally been recovered from most unexpected circumstances," she announced with quiet satisfaction. "Hidden among Miss Greenshaw's personal effects, where someone with intimate knowledge of her habits would know to conceal crucial documents." Inspector Slack found it quite illuminating, particularly the sections detailing her growing concerns about your professional conduct and her intention to seek alternative medical care. The revelation that Miss Greenshaw had discovered his financial irregularities and planned to expose his unprofessional behavior finally destroyed Dr. Haydock's carefully constructed facade. His hands began trembling uncontrollably as the weight of accumulated evidence pressed down upon him, his face assuming the expression of someone whose elaborate deceptions had finally collapsed under the inexorable pressure of truth systematically revealed. The drawing room at the vicarage had acquired the hushed tension of a courtroom as the principal players in Miss Greenshaw's tragedy gathered for what everyone sensed would be the final act of their village drama. Inspector Slack stood near the window with official gravity, while the assembled company, Griselda wringing her hands, Colonel Bantry rigid with military bearing, Mrs. Price Ridley clutching her lorgnette, Timothy Forsyth pale but hopeful, and Mrs. Dane red-eyed with grief, turned toward Miss Marple as she settled into her customary chair with characteristic composure. Dr. Haydock occupied the chair nearest the door, his medical bag positioned within easy reach and his hands clasped with studied calm that barely concealed the tremor in his fingers. His usually confident demeanor had acquired a brittle quality, like ice beginning to crack under unexpected pressure, and his eyes avoided direct contact with the assembled faces that had once regarded him with unquestioning trust and professional respect. Miss Marple's knitting needles began their gentle rhythm as she spoke with the deceptive mildness that had preceded countless revelations throughout her long experience with human nature's darker complexities. "It has been such an instructive case," she observed, her pale blue eyes moving thoughtfully around the room. "One learns so much about the elaborate lengths to which desperation will drive otherwise respectable people when their carefully constructed lives begin to crumble." She paused to examine her stitches with apparent concentration before continuing with devastating precision. "The letter from Mr. Weatherby did arrive, exactly as promised, but it never reached Miss Greenshaw because someone with intimate knowledge of postal schedules and village routines intercepted it at the earliest possible moment. Someone who understood that the inheritance settlement contained information far more dangerous than mere financial details." Dr. Haydock's composure showed its first visible crack as his hands tightened involuntarily in his lap. "I'm sure I don't understand your implications, Miss Marple," he managed, though his voice lacked its usual authoritative warmth. "My only concern was Miss Greenshaw's medical welfare during what must have been a stressful period of financial adjustment." Miss Marple's needles continued their methodical clicking as she produced a small rectangle of cream paper, its surface pierced with neat needle holes and bearing the ghostly impression of blue monogrammed printing. "Mr. Broom, the cobbler in Much Benham, remembers quite clearly the gentleman who insisted on providing backing paper for Miss Greenshaw's glove repair. Such thoughtful attention to detail, particularly when the paper proved to be a fragment of Mr. Weatherby's distinctive correspondence. The physical evidence struck Dr. Haydock with visible force, his medical training recognizing the inexorable logic of forensic proof, even as his criminal instincts sought escape routes that no longer existed. His face had acquired the waxy pallor of someone confronting the collapse of elaborate deceptions, and his breathing had become shallow with the controlled panic of a trapped animal. Inspector Slack stepped forward with official authority, his notebook ready to record what everyone now understood would be a confession rather than continued denials. Dr. Haydock, I think it's time you explained your relationship with Miss Greenshaw's financial affairs and your particular interest in her inheritance arrangements. The systematic pressure finally shattered Dr. Haydock's remaining defenses as Miss Marple delivered her most devastating revelation with characteristic gentleness. Miss Greenshaw had discovered your substitution of lactose tablets for her prescribed morphine, hadn't she? She had them analyzed privately and threatened to report your pharmaceutical fraud to the medical board unless you provided immediate restitution and ceased practicing medicine entirely. The truth emerged in broken fragments as Dr. Haydock's professional facade crumbled completely. His gambling debts had mounted beyond any possibility of legitimate repayment. His practice was failing due to whispered concerns about his reliability, and Miss Greenshaw's threat of exposure would have meant not merely professional disgrace, but criminal prosecution for fraud. The inheritance announcement had seemed like divine providence. £40,000 would solve every crisis, while providing enough surplus to disappear entirely from the mounting pressures of village life. His confession poured forth with desperate urgency, describing the elaborate planning that had preceded Miss Greenshaw's murder with chilling precision. The forged telegram had been composed using stolen medical school letterhead, the distinctive blue monogram providing authenticity that convinced everyone of its legitimacy. He had intercepted the genuine inheritance documents by bribing the London coach driver, then used the cream paper as backing for glove repairs that would ensure Miss Greenshaw handled nothing dangerous on the day of her death. The poisoning itself had required considerable pharmaceutical expertise, extracting pure digitalis from his medical supplies and calculating precise dosages that would ensure rapid heart failure without immediate detection. The dual delivery system, dissolved in modified saccharine tablets and held in reserve through the lemonade, guaranteed success regardless of her consumption patterns while providing multiple opportunities for administration during the crowded fete. The bitter taste she detected wasn't from digitalis at all, he admitted with broken pride in his technical expertise. A few drops of quinine solution, nothing more. Bitter enough to make her refuse the drink publicly, creating witnesses to suspicious circumstances, while the real poison worked through the saccharine tablets she had already consumed with her afternoon tea. Miss Marple's gentle voice cut through his self-justification with surgical accuracy. The most tragic aspect is that Miss Greenshaw might have helped with your financial difficulties if approached honestly. She was known for charitable assistance to those who served the community faithfully. Your fear of professional disgrace prevented you from seeking the very help that murder was meant to provide. As Inspector Slack moved forward with handcuffs, Dr. Haydock made one final attempt at dignity. "I never intended to become a murderer," he whispered. "But the pressures, the constant fear of exposure, they drove me to desperate measures that seemed reasonable at the time." Miss Marple's response carried the weight of someone who had observed human nature's complexities for decades without losing essential compassion. Desperation reveals character rather than creating it, Doctor. The capacity for such elaborate deception suggests moral corruption that preceded your financial difficulties rather than resulting from them. The village watched in stunned silence as their trusted physician was led away, understanding that the comfortable certainties of rural life had been shattered by the revelation that evil could wear the most respectable faces and commit the most heinous crimes while maintaining the appearance of professional virtue and community service. The morning after Dr. Haydock's arrest brought An unusual stillness to St. Mary Mead, as though the village itself held its breath while processing the shocking revelation that their trusted physician had been a calculating murderer. The comfortable certainties of rural life had been shattered by the discovery that evil could wear the most respectable face, leaving residents to grapple with uncomfortable questions about trust, judgment, and the masks that human nature could assume when desperation drove otherwise civilized people to unthinkable acts. At the vicarage, Griselda moved through her morning routine with subdued efficiency, her usual cheerfulness tempered by the weight of recent events. Miss Marple arrived with her customary basket of roses, observing with characteristic perception how the familiar rooms had acquired an atmosphere of violated sanctuary. "I still cannot quite comprehend it," Griselda confided as they settled over tea. "Dr. Haydock seemed so thoroughly reliable, so genuinely concerned for his patients' welfare. How could we all have been so completely deceived?" Miss Marple's knitting needles began their gentle rhythm as she considered the question with philosophical calm. "Human nature has remarkable capacity for compartmentalization, my dear. Dr. Haydock maintained his professional competence while gradually succumbing to moral corruption, creating two distinct personalities that coexisted until desperation forced them into conflict. We saw what we expected to see: a respected physician whose authority discouraged closer scrutiny of his increasingly desperate circumstances. Inspector Slack's final report provided the concrete resolution that village speculation required. Timothy Forsyth received formal vindication along with grudging apology, his earlier indiscretions now viewed as harmless mischief rather than criminal intent. The young man approached Miss Marple with genuine humility, his usual charming swagger replaced by sobered gratitude. "I owe you everything," he said earnestly. "Without your patience and perception, I would certainly have faced the gallows for another man's crime." The investigation's expansion revealed the full extent of Dr. Haydock's criminal activities, including systematic pharmaceutical fraud, insurance billing irregularities, and prescription substitutions that had been occurring for months before Miss Greenshaw's murder. His gambling debts proved even more extensive than initially suspected, involving London creditors whose mounting pressure had created the desperate circumstances that made murder seem like rational solution rather than moral catastrophe. Colonel Bantry struggled to process the tactical sophistication of the doctor's criminal planning, recognizing strategic thinking that rivaled military deception in its complexity and ruthlessness. "Never imagined a village physician capable of such elaborate schemes," he admitted with characteristic bluntness. "The forged correspondence, intercepted documents, precisely, calculated poisoning. It demonstrates organizational skills that might have served honorable purposes if directed toward legitimate objectives." Mrs. Price Ridley found herself in the uncomfortable position of revising fundamental assumptions about social respectability and moral character. Her earlier certainty about Timothy's guilt now seemed embarrassingly misguided, while her long-standing admiration for Dr. Haydock had been irrevocably destroyed by the revelation of his systematic betrayal of professional trust and community confidence. The physical evidence continued yielding secrets that confirmed Miss Marple's deductive reasoning. The wasp found drowned in the lemonade jug proved particularly significant, demonstrating that the bitter taste Miss Greenshaw detected had been artificially created to provide witnesses, while the real poison worked through previously administered saccharine tablets. Dr. Haydock's pharmaceutical expertise had enabled him to calculate precise digitalist dosages that would ensure rapid heart failure without immediate detection. Mrs. Dane mourned not only her mistress, but also the violation of trust that had made Miss Greenshaw's final days a period of manipulation rather than peaceful anticipation. The housekeeper's grief was compounded by guilt over failing to protect someone whose generous nature had made her vulnerable to exploitation by those who understood her habits with professional intimacy. As autumn settled over St. Mary Mead, The village gradually adjusted to new realities, while maintaining the resilient character that had sustained rural communities through centuries of change and challenge. The annual church fete would continue, though future refreshment arrangements would involve multiple volunteers rather than individual supervision, and medical care would be provided by Dr. Pemberton from Much Benham until suitable replacement could be found. Miss Marple resumed her quiet routine with philosophical acceptance, understanding that evil was a permanent feature of human condition, rather than aberration that could be eliminated through vigilance alone. Her experience had taught her that wisdom and observation provided better protection than innocence and trust, though she maintained compassion for both victim and perpetrator in this tragedy of moral corruption. The letter that never arrived had ultimately revealed far more than inheritance details. It had exposed the dangerous capacity for evil that could flourish beneath respectability's protective surface. Village life would continue with harder-won wisdom about human nature's complexity and the necessity of looking beyond appearances when evaluating character and motive. In her cottage garden that evening, Miss Marple reflected that Miss Greenshaw's death served as unwelcome reminder that evil required no special circumstances to flourish, only opportunity, desperation, and moral flexibility to sacrifice others for personal advantage. These qualities could emerge from unexpected sources when pressure revealed true character beneath civilized pretense, teaching St. Mary Mead that even the coziest settings could harbor humanity's darkest impulses. The weeks following Dr. Haydock's conviction brought a peculiar quality of subdued reflection to St. Mary Mead, as though the village had awakened from comfortable innocence to discover that evil could flourish beneath the most respectable facades. The familiar routines continued with determined normalcy, but conversations carried new undertones of caution that would have been unthinkable before Miss Greenshaw's murder revealed how thoroughly their trusted physician had betrayed the community's faith. Miss Greenshaw's funeral took place under grey November skies, attended by villagers who came with careful expressions and genuine grief for a woman whose charitable intentions had been revealed only after her death. Mr. Weatherby arrived from London with the documents that had cost Miss Greenshaw her life, including her final letter expressing plans to endow scholarships for rural nurses, a bitter irony that made Griselda weep openly during the service. The solicitor's subsequent revelation that Miss Greenshaw had suspected Dr. Haydock's pharmaceutical substitutions and planned to report him provided the final piece of motive that had driven the doctor to desperate murder. Timothy Forsyth underwent remarkable transformation from charming wastrel to genuinely reformed character, his narrow escape from judicial error having sobered him beyond recognition. When Mr. Weatherby mentioned a junior clerkship available in his London office, Timothy accepted with humble gratitude that suggested authentic moral awakening rather than convenient performance. Mrs. Kidwell, half proud and half anxious, promised weekly letters and packed sandwiches for his journey toward respectability, while the village watched his departure with cautious approval. The trial proceedings in Much Benham revealed the full extent of Dr. Haydock's criminal enterprise, including systematic pharmaceutical fraud that had affected dozens of patients over months of illegal activity. His substitution of ineffective compounds for prescribed medications had prolonged suffering while generating additional consultation fees, creating a network of exploitation protected by professional authority that discouraged patient complaints or independent verification of treatment effectiveness. Colonel Bantry struggled to reconcile his memories of the doctor's apparent competence with the calculated cruelty the evidence revealed. One expects certain standards from medical professionals, he confided to Miss Marple during their morning constitutional. The systematic betrayal of trust challenges fundamental assumptions about character and moral consistency that make community life possible. His military mind, which arranged facts in orderly formations, balked at the compartmentalized nature of Dr. Haydock's personality. Mrs. Price Ridley found herself revising long-held opinions with uncomfortable humility. her lorgnette now focusing with nervous intensity on familiar faces as though seeking signs of deception she had previously failed to detect. The comfortable authority that had characterized her social observations had been replaced by anxious uncertainty about evaluating human character accurately, teaching her that respectability could provide perfect camouflage for criminal intent. Miss Marple observed these changes with characteristic perception, understanding that the village's resilience required acknowledging harsh realities while maintaining social bonds that made rural life sustainable. Her investigation had revealed patterns of manipulation extending far beyond Miss Greenshaw's murder, including Dr. Haydock's systematic exploitation of patient confidences to gather intelligence about financial circumstances and personal vulnerabilities that he used to identify potential victims. The practical consequences affected the entire community's access to medical care, as Dr. Pemberton from Much Benham provided temporary services while struggling with his existing patient load. Several villagers discovered that chronic conditions had worsened due to ineffective substitute medications, requiring genuine treatment that had been delayed by months of fraudulent prescriptions designed to maximize consultation fees rather than promote healing. Mrs. Dane mourned not only her mistress, but also the violation of trust that had made Miss Greenshaw's final weeks a period of manipulation rather than peaceful anticipation. Her grief was compounded by guilt over failing to protect someone whose generous nature had made her vulnerable to exploitation by those who understood her habits with professional intimacy and used medical authority to gain unprecedented access to personal information. As winter approached, the village developed new patterns of social interaction based on hard-won wisdom about human nature's capacity for deception. The comfortable certainties of rural life had been permanently altered by the discovery that systematic betrayal could operate undetected for months, protected by professional respectability that discouraged closer scrutiny of increasingly desperate circumstances. The annual preparations for Christmas proceeded with determined cheerfulness, though organizers implemented multiple oversight procedures reflecting collective determination to prevent future exploitation of community trust. Conversations carried subtle undertones of verification and cross-reference that would have seemed paranoid before recent events demonstrated how thoroughly authority figures could betray public confidence while maintaining appearances of competence and integrity. In her cottage garden that evening, Miss Marple reflected that Dr. Haydock's crimes had provided unwelcome but valuable education about evil's capacity to flourish beneath respectability's protective surface. The case had demonstrated that desperation could compartmentalize conscience, allowing otherwise capable people to commit unthinkable acts when they convinced themselves that circumstances justified extreme measures against innocent victims. Her knitting needles moved with thoughtful rhythm as she considered the small details that had ultimately unraveled the doctor's elaborate deception: the mended glove, the wasp in lemonade, the precise timing of pharmaceutical recommendations. Truth, like persistent weeds, would always find ways to push through the most meticulously constructed pavements of criminal deception, requiring only patience to observe and wisdom to interpret the patterns that revealed human nature's darker possibilities beneath civilized pretense. St. Mary Mead would endure as rural communities had for centuries, though with harder-won knowledge about the necessity of looking beyond appearances when evaluating character and motive in their seemingly peaceful corner of an increasingly complex world. Spring returned to St. Mary Mead with the gentle persistence of hope, overcoming winter's harsh lessons, bringing daffodils to cottage gardens and cautious optimism to conversations that had carried undertones of suspicion throughout the dark months following Dr. Haydock's conviction. The village had survived its encounter with calculated evil, emerging with deeper wisdom about human nature's complexities while maintaining the essential bonds of community that made rural life both precious and resilient despite its occasional betrayals of trust. Miss Marple sat in her garden on a particularly lovely April morning. her knitting needles moving with contented rhythm as she observed the familiar patterns of village life resuming their comfortable cadence. The postman delivered letters without drama. Children played with innocent laughter, and neighbors greeted each other with genuine warmth rather than the careful politeness that had characterized social interactions during the investigation's aftermath. Time, that most reliable healer, had begun its patient work of restoring confidence while preserving the valuable lessons learned through tragic experience. Timothy Forsyth's weekly letters from London arrived with reports of steady progress in Mr. Weatherby's firm, his transformation from charming wastrel to reliable clerk, providing the village with satisfying evidence that people could indeed change when circumstances demanded authentic moral growth. The brush with false accusation had chiseled away his youthful arrogance, leaving behind a young man humbled by experience and quietly determined to prove his worth through honest labor rather than schemes and charm. Mrs. Kidwell displayed his correspondence with maternal pride, reading selected passages aloud while maintaining strict privacy about more personal revelations concerning his gratitude and determination never again to risk judicial error through careless behavior. The new doctor, Dr. Morrison, had arrived from Edinburgh with impeccable credentials and refreshing transparency about his methods, inviting patients to verify prescriptions independently and maintaining detailed records available for inspection by anyone concerned about treatment effectiveness. His approach initially seemed excessive to villagers accustomed to trusting medical authority without question. But recent experience had taught them that verification provided comfort rather than insult when dealing with professional services affecting their health and welfare. Trust, they had learned, could be rebuilt through openness rather than blind faith. Colonel Bantry found himself appointed to the parish council with responsibility for overseeing community events, his military organizational skills proving invaluable for implementing oversight procedures that prevented individual control over activities involving public safety or financial management. The annual church fete would continue under multiple supervision, ensuring that no single person could again exploit community trust for criminal purposes, while maintaining the cheerful traditions that made village life distinctive and enjoyable. As Miss Marple reflected on the case that had so profoundly affected their quiet community, she marveled at how the smallest details had ultimately unraveled Dr. Haydock's elaborate deception. The letter that never arrived had been more than a simple postal delay. It had become the central thread that, when pulled carefully, revealed the entire tapestry of manipulation and murder. The fragment of Mr. Weatherby's distinctive cream paper, discovered in Miss Greenshaw's mended glove, had provided irrefutable proof that the crucial correspondence had indeed reached the village, only to be intercepted by someone with intimate knowledge of both postal schedules and the victim's meticulous habits. The wasp drowning contentedly in the lemonade jug had been equally revealing, its presence demonstrating that the bitter taste Miss Greenshaw detected was artificially created to provide witnesses, while the real poison worked through previously administered saccharine tablets. Each seemingly insignificant detail, the precise timing of medical recommendations, the sophisticated pharmaceutical knowledge required for dual-method poisoning, the calculated manipulation of inheritance expectations, had painted an increasingly clear picture of professional expertise corrupted by desperate greed. Mrs. Price Ridley had developed unexpected humility about her social observations, tempering her authoritative pronouncements with careful qualifications that acknowledged the limitations of surface appearances when evaluating character and motive. Her lorgnette still focused with characteristic intensity, but her conclusions carried new awareness that respectability could provide perfect camouflage for criminal intent, requiring deeper investigation before rendering final judgment about moral character and community standing. The physical reminders of Miss Greenshaw's tragedy had been carefully removed or repurposed, though her memorial garden behind the church provided lasting testimony to charitable intentions that had been revealed only after her death. The scholarships for rural nurses that her estate funded would train medical professionals committed to serving communities like St. Mary Mead with integrity and competence that honored her memory while addressing the practical needs her murder had highlighted about professional accountability and patient protection. Miss Marple understood that the case had demonstrated both human nature's capacity for elaborate deception and its ultimate inability to sustain complex lies when subjected to patient observation and systematic analysis. Dr. Haydick's pharmaceutical expertise had enabled sophisticated criminal planning, but his fundamental misunderstanding of village dynamics had ultimately ensured his exposure through the accumulated weight of small inconsistencies that revealed larger truths about character and desperation. As winter's first snowflakes began dusting the ancient elm outside her cottage window, Miss Marple sat with her knitting, a faint, knowing smile playing on her lips. The comfortable illusion of absolute safety had been replaced by a more mature understanding of the world, yet St. Mary Mead had emerged stronger for its encounter with evil. The village would continue its quiet existence with harder-won knowledge about the necessity of looking beyond appearances, but also with renewed appreciation for the genuine goodness that flourished among neighbors who chose integrity over convenience when facing life's inevitable challenges and moral temptations. Her own quiet presence, often underestimated, had once again brought light to darkness through the gentle, persistent observation of small, overlooked details that others dismissed as trivial. Truth, like a hardy perennial, had pushed through the frozen ground of deception, and with it came the enduring peace that justice, however delayed, inevitably provided to those patient enough to wait and wise enough to see.